What's up, guys? Coming at you from Shenzhen, and in today's video I am going to speak to you about the reasons why China likes the idea of 4 more years of Trump, and also why they like the idea of democracy for America. I came up with this idea after reading a Bloomberg article, which I will speak to you a bit more about in a second, but I should probably quickly mention this is a very random video. I'm just turning on my camera and speaking. You probably saw my last video was a little bit more well planned out, where I wrote out everything I wanted to say, so I made sure to hit all the points that I wanted to hit, more or less, and that's why I prefer that format over this. This format, I always end up kicking myself in post saying I forgot to mention this point that I wanted to mention. But it's a lot more natural, and I can put more content out because I don't have to wait until I plan something out specifically. And you guys can let me know what you prefer, if you prefer this format, the other format, or a mix of both. But on to the topic itself. I'll start off with mentioning what the Bloomberg article says. So the Bloomberg article focuses more on why the Chinese government is warming up to the idea of 4 more years of Trump. And they pin it down to the idea that the Chinese government believes that 4 more years of Trump comes with the highest likelihood of a catalyst or accelerating the downfall of America. Now, I've spoken to a lot of people, myself, over the last few weeks and months who also like the idea of 4 more years of Trump. But it's for different reasons. And now I'm sure there probably are people who also have this more sinister hope that 4 more years of Trump will come with the inevitable downfall of America. But again, the reasons that I received were a little bit different, and I'll cover them in a bit. I think one of the things I should address first is how strange that sounds, because if you really think about it, this administration in the US is responsible for the most aggression against China in a very long time, in terms of trade wars, in terms of sending people around the world to prevent or convince countries not to use Huawei or threaten their partners when they are thinking about joining the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, with Victoria, Australia, I believe it was. And obviously the very insulting Inter-Parliamentary Association on China, I believe it's called, by Marco Rubio, which really resembles an alliance from the past where foreign countries got together to contain and exploit China. And it looks really similar to that. So people were really insulted by that, but they're still saying, give us 4 more years of this administration. And why is that? There's a few reasons. I've had detailed discussions with a lot of people. And one of the things you got to understand is that people really like their government here. They don't think it's perfect, but they really like it. And that's a point I think a lot of people outside of China have a difficult time believing. So I don't want to focus too much time on that. If you don't believe me on that, you don't want to believe it, then fine. It's not 100% essential to the point, but it is important to understand that Chinese people use their perspective of their comparison point is, where did they come from and where are they now and what direction are they going? And so of course China has suffered from before the CCP came to power and during the CCP's rule, where this current government was in power during a lot of suffering, and a lot of people make or say that this government is responsible for that suffering, and in many ways they're correct. The government made a lot of missteps, but now what they are doing is they're looking at what kind of progress they've made in the last decade plus, where they've now become the second biggest economy in the world, the largest, fastest growing middle class in the world, the highest upward mobility from poor to middle class, and so much more. I mean, you've got, what is it, like 140 million Chinese traveling overseas every year, and they come back, by the way. They're not seeking asylum in other countries, and they really like their country. Now, what this situation in America has done is it's given them another reference point to further appreciate their system. Because there was always this idea here by a lot of people who always had an appreciation and an admiration for Western democratic systems. And there was a tendency to think, okay, we're eventually going to move towards this direction. And they probably will eventually. There's going to be reforms. But they've become less rushed to see that happen. There was a clear reason why not to do it before, and Lee Kuan Yew, he's recognized as the founder of Singapore. he covers this a lot, and he used to always cover these topics in regards to needing to get your population to a certain level of education before you even think about democracy. I mean, otherwise, how are you going to have people that don't know how to choose the best leader voting for their leadership based on a popularity contest? And you can't really make that argument anymore, can you? There's a huge middle class here. Most people here are educated. There isn't the illiteracy rates that there were before. This is a highly educated society. But now what they're doing is they're looking at America and they're saying, you know what? What happens when you have a highly educated society and a democracy? It comes with the risk of electing somebody like Donald Trump. And that is a result of mob rule. I believe it was Plato who said that's what democracy is mob rule. And they're starting to think about what are the risks involved to change China to that system too quickly, when this government that they have now, that they've also suffered under in the past, is finally starting to bear fruits, is finally starting to move in the correct direction, finally listens to its people. You know, even though they don't have a democracy, the local leaders are regularly removed from their post, or, you know, you can almost say overthrown when they dissatisfy the people. There are feedback systems in place. There are all kinds of things that happen that allow people to be heard here. But they're looking at, if we went on a full-on democratic system, this is the risk that we could end up with somebody like Trump. Now, conversely, you could say that Western systems should never ever think about implementing a system like they have in China. I'm of the idea that China's system is best for China. In the West, if our democracies are broken, we should figure out how to fix them. And anybody who argues otherwise, obviously you can make the same argument. What if these Western countries moved to a system where there was a single party system? Imagine the risks involved in that. What if that single party system was led by somebody like Donald Trump? You know, that's the other risk. But what they have in their hands right now is something that's working really well. And I think there would be more fear about getting rid of that system and wondering about what would happen after getting rid of that system, rather than staying with the known that is working so well for them right now. The other thing that it's forced them to reflect on, of course, is how are the leaders chosen in China? Well, it's based on merit. Everybody knows here that you need to be the best of the best. You need to be the top of your class to get into the party. The government system here, the government workers are made up of highly educated people. It's not based on a popularity contest. And I know that may sound a little bit insulting to Western systems, because obviously the popularity system could also work if the person who's running for a certain government role efficiently markets what their talents are and efficiently tells their story about why they're the best candidate. But it's not always the most educated or the best candidate that's chosen, is it? That's especially apparent by today. Now, the thing is when I'm using America for this example, it is the most extreme example of what could go wrong with a democracy, of course. And there's all sorts of other issues in terms of the lobbyists, in terms of almost private industry writing the laws in America, and the influence that they have over politicians. There's a whole host of other issues. But even if you were to ask the people here, if you asked them would they trade their current leader for a Chinese version of Donald Trump, of course they'd say no. But I mean, all of the other leaders, if you look at what the other democracies are producing, if you ask them if they would trade their current leader for a Chinese version of Justin Trudeau or Boris Johnson, you know, of course they wouldn't. I can tell you that 100% that they wouldn't. And so what is going on in America has made China more unified and more confident that they're doing things the right way. And the attacks that are coming from the current administration is also strengthening China's unity. You know, one of my other friends said that the times in China's history where China was the most unified was when there was a common enemy. And this propaganda that's going on, this constant barrage from overseas, this attempt by America to interfere with China's kind of political alliances around the world and their aspirations, is something that's actually unifying the Chinese people more. I mean, especially when the insinuations are coming from somebody is saying that your system is broken, your system isn't working, while America's system is looking like it is right now. this thing has made everybody here so much more unified in so many ways. So that's one of the other reasons. Now, the final reason, which is very valid also, is when America is going around the world and they're telling people, don't cooperate with China, don't use their telecommunications equipment, don't sign the Belt and Road Initiative. When it's coming from a country that is led by a person like Donald Trump, there's a highly likelihood that these target countries are going to say, why would I listen to you guys? You know, you guys don't have your, you know what, together. And you've got a leader like this. It would make them think a little bit more about who is it we really want to be cooperating with here. And the other benefit, of course, for the countries is that you're not going to have systems in China where 4 years later a different party is going to be elected and all of the priorities change, or deals that they've made with certain countries are going to fall apart. For example, with the U.S., they can just walk away from the JCPOA deal with Iran. They can just break the contract because it's a different administration. There's very little accountability in America. But I'm moving on to a little bit too far off topic now. Now I'm talking about why other countries may be in a position to trust China a lot more than they could trust America. And that's a bigger separate topic that I can eventually do. But these are some of the reasons that Chinese people like the idea of Trump being reelected. It makes them more confident about their system. It makes them more unified. And it makes them look a heck of a lot more attractive to people who are being told not to cooperate with China. And this should really initiate a lot of reflection from people in America or people in these other countries. And they really should think about this, because China is a system, China's political system has been continually evolving. And the thing that China can do that the West can't do is China can look at what the West is doing and saying, what elements do we like about the West and what don't we like about the West? But the West doesn't have the ability to say, what do we like about China and what do we dislike about China? Is there anything that we can take from China in terms of how are they accomplishing so much? How are they doing so well? Can we learn anything from them? That's not a question you can answer. You can really ask in the West. That's political suicide. I mean, even when you look at when Bernie Sanders even thought to compliment after he visited. So when he was running for presidential candidate, his opposition dug up a video of him after he returned from the Soviet Union, saying that the subway systems in the Soviet are beautiful. And they were. Everybody knows that. They had chandeliers and everything like that. And that was a point of criticism. You're not even allowed to say that the subway systems look nice in a communist country. You know, I think it was, I believe Bill Clinton, he waited until his last day of office where he said to people that Americans need to get used to the idea of no longer being the number one superpower and having to share power. He wouldn't say that during his term. A lot of these things, you're going to trigger people. And so this gives China a huge advantage over the US also, is that they're able to learn from other systems and create a uniquely inspired system that works for them the best. And in terms of that reflection, I did a thread on Twitter, which I am actually going to read that word for. I'm going to find somewhere to pull over, and I'd like to read it to you, where I ask some people to, especially people who spend a lot of time criticizing China and its government, I ask them to ask themselves some really important questions. And I got to find somewhere to pull over so I can read it to you, and I don't want to miss anything on that. After this light turns green, I'm going to pull over. All right, so I found somewhere to pull over here, and I am going to read you this tweet in terms of asking yourself some important questions in the West, especially if you spend large amounts of time criticizing China and its system. Let me turn this off so you're not hearing the blinker noises here. All right, so what I did was, this is a thread, and the first tweet was based on a retweet. So I retweeted something that was also a retweet of Pompeo saying that America is nothing like China. And he says he focuses on human rights and all this kind of stuff. And that's probably something I should mention too, because you know what? You know what's going to happen is inevitably when you talk about the positives of China, you've got these really convenient cognitive dissonance propaganda stories that people can revert to so that they can say, well, no, I don't want to hear what China's doing good because they do this, because they have intern camps, because they have 15% of their Uyghur population in concentration camps. And it's like, would you actually think about that for a second? Would you think about what it takes to house 1.5 million people, 2 million people? Would you think about this story that you're being fed? Well, first of all, we know full well that the media continually lies to us, and there's certain topics that are bipartisan. The weapons of mass destruction story was one of them. So a lot of it has to do when it comes to foreign policy stuff. From the left to the right, everybody bought into that story, and we knew we were lied to. But we don't have this ability to then look at the next time we're being lied to and hear someone say, and ask ourselves, hold on a second, this doesn't make sense. If China was trying to eradicate their ethnic minorities, why were the ethnic minorities not subjected to the one-child policy? If they're trying to get rid of Islam, why did they build 20,000 mosques over the last couple of decades? Why do they have 10 Islamic colleges? Why are ethnic minorities, why do they have an affirmative action-like plan to allow ethnic minorities to enter top universities with lower scores? You know, why, there's kids here, there's the Muslim kids here in Shenzhen, from Qinghai, they go to the mosque on the weekends to learn Arabic characters. Like, and then this narrative is filled with exposed liars who continually lie about what they know about in Xinjiang. And I've exposed a bunch of them on my Twitter threads. And you've got to ask yourself the question, if this is so true, if this is so obvious, why is this narrative relying on so many exposed liars? And maybe I'll drop some links to the to those tweets in my description of this video so that you can go look through them yourself. But on to the main, back to this tweet thread. So Pompeo is saying America is nothing like China. And so this guy named Gourmet Communist, he recently changed his name to this. Despite his name, he's actually an American. So he says, we are bombing 7 countries, China isn't. We are killing blacks, China isn't. We have over 1,000 foreign military bases, China doesn't. We have a spy agency that's staging dozens of violent coups all over the world, China doesn't. We have corporations writing our laws, China doesn't. So I retweeted that. That's the foundation of my first tweet. And I say, questions for China government haters. Do you think if you spent as much time criticizing and calling out your own countries and allies, you could make more actual change? This is what you're supposed to be able to do in a democracy after all, right? Why waste your time on an inflexible dictatorship? And so the next question is, if yes, why aren't you doing it? If you are doing it, why is Julian Assange still in prison? Why are things like this still happening? And how are things like this even possible? So that used a retweet of a video on what Australia did in West Papua. And it's pretty remarkable how they went in there and they basically took over, diverted or detained some of the human rights activists that were trying to get to the UN to expose what they were doing. And I'm going to go one step deeper. That original tweet was based on calling somebody out who was using the really insulting Chinese flag. I mean, it's insulting to everybody in China to see their flag with a death-causing virus on it. And what was interesting is this guy, Stephen, he continually talks about the Uyghurs also. And I was curious what he had to say about the Aborigine in Australia. And he only ever mentioned them once. And it was in the context to joke about a game, a feature or a language that was coming out for Pokemon Go or something like that. And he says, we're going to see an extinct Aboriginal Australian language come back before we see that. So that's what his joke relied on. Using extinct Aboriginal culture, which of course the West was responsible for, largely responsible for in the West, and joking about it. That's the only time he ever had concern for the Aboriginal people. So that deserves a video on its own about the hypocrisy of a lot of these people speaking out about China. But continuing on to the next tweet under that, what I say under that is, why are you still trying to take action on what you think is happening behind closed doors in China while you do nothing about what you know is happening in open markets born from things that you did? And so that is, I relied on a retweet of a pretty sad photo of how Libya, basically slavery is back now after the Obama administration supported the overthrowing of Gaddafi, and the country's kind of deteriorated into chaos. It was once one of the richest countries in Africa. Now it's on the brink of bankruptcy, and slaves are being traded in open markets. And some of these pictures are terrible. You're kind of looking at the fear on their faces. And nobody's talking about this. They're theorizing about what's happening in China with a lot of BS, with a lot of lying, when this is happening right in front of your eyes, and it's something that you guys did, and you've got nothing to say about it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's because you guys did it. You don't want to talk about it. Of course, I'm putting probably too much undue blame on individuals when the media that you guys are relying on is largely responsible for directing you in the directions that you are, no matter how much you may think it is your free will. So on to the next tweet. I say, why couldn't democratically elected President Obama keep his promise to voters to shut down Guantanamo Bay, which literally holds Uyghurs, you know, the same ethnic group you've said you want to help all this time? And so this one I rely on a retweet of something that Putin said, where he says that he's dealt with 3 presidents so far, and they're basically puppets. You know, after you're elected, people come in and they say, okay, this is how things work. And he says, do you really think Obama didn't want to close Guantanamo Bay? No, of course. He wanted to close it, but he couldn't. And so he talks about why nothing really ever changes in the U.S., because it's not really the president who's calling the shots in so many ways. So then the next tweet after that is, why do you believe China should be more accountable when you punish even the families of anyone who dares to question your governments? And so that is, I retweeted a video of Pompeo, which is really remarkable. So the International Court obviously wants to, as many of you may know, wants to look into the war crimes that America committed in Afghanistan. And even wanting to look into it, even wanting to question America, resulted in Pompeo coming out and sanctioning the people involved in it, and also sanctioning their family members from being able to come to America. I mean, that kind of sounds like almost like a stereotypical what you'd expect from North Korea. You know, punishing the family members of people who say things about the government that you don't like. It's a really weird thing to do while asking for other countries to be accountable. Then the next question I ask is, do you think if the lives of Chinese people would continue to improve, maintaining one of the highest upward mobility opportunity rates in the world for their poor, having the fastest growing middle class, racing towards exceeding America's GDP, they'd really want China to have it? And that's an important question, because staying the number one superpower is a matter of national security for America. So if they really thought that introducing democracy into China would be the best thing for its people, it would make them even more prosperous, do you think they'd really be promoting it? Of course they wouldn't be promoting it for China. And they don't promote it for a lot of their other allies who are way more of a dictatorship than China is. So I move on to saying, you can call this whataboutism if you like, but there's important questions here. If democracy for China is supposed to prevent things like this, why are your democracies doing this? If you, the people, have the real power in your democracies, why are you doing these things? Because this is, I think this creates probably a secondary interesting question. You know, you get a lot of people who constantly say, oh, I don't hate the Chinese people, I hate the Chinese government. Which is difficult to separate when you consider how much the people here support their government. And again, that's something that may be a fruitless argument with people who don't want to believe that. But conversely, could people who don't like what America does around the world, could they say, I don't hate the American government, I hate the American people? Or I hate the American people as much as I hate the American government? Because at the end of the day, their government is a representation of their people and their people's choices. At least it's supposed to be, right? So there's a lot of implications when you really think about this question about the things that you guys are doing that aren't supposed to be happening. And the things that you think shouldn't happen in China if China all of a sudden had a democracy. And there's so many examples to say China would be better, they'd be more responsible, there'd be more accountable, there'd be more, all of these things, if only they had democracy. And we're seeing firsthand that that's not necessarily true. So I finish off by saying, if you suddenly diverted your China bashing attention to your own countries and allies, do you think these things would change? If you really believe your time is better spent trying to change a dictatorship, you've got some important questions you should probably ask yourself. And again, it's the same thing. It's saying that if you want to make the world a better place, you either don't think your governments are doing anything wrong, or you think they're doing something wrong and you can't change it, and you're spending your time trying to change China. And if you think you have a higher likelihood of changing China, that indicates a pretty big problem. Or you think that you have the ability to change what your own countries are doing, but you don't want to change it. And that creates implications in terms of exposing the hypocrisy of these people. So that's what I want to finish off with. I think I'm rambling on here. I'm looking at the timer on my camera, and I think I've gone on a little bit too long. But I just wanted to give you some insights into some of the thoughts on the ground here and why people believe the government is really effective here. Why the Trump administration has made them stronger, more confident, and potentially in a position to better compete in the world than there would be if there was a rational, reasonable president leading America. And just some things to think about in terms of how you look at these systems. Because of course in the West we grow up with this idea that democracy is like an ultimate word that means so many things, and you don't actually have to think about it any deeper than that, because democracy means freedom. It doesn't matter that the Freedom House says 70% of democracies around the world lack basic freedoms. That's all we care about. It's time for some of these guys to actually sit down and think about what they're saying in a more meaningful way, because that's obviously not happening right now. Anyways, again, I'm going to risk rambling on towards the end here. It's not a very organized talk. Again, let me know if you prefer my more organized ones, because this is a bit too messy. And I'll catch you guys in the next video anyways. Hope you enjoyed. Peace.